Belling the Cat by Aesop. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The mice once called a meeting to decide on a plan to free themselves of their enemy, the cat. At least, they wished to find some way of knowing when she was coming, so they might have time to run away. Indeed, something had to be done, for they lived in such constant fear of her claws that they hardly dared stir from their dens by night or day. Many plans were discussed, but none of them was thought good enough. At last, a very young mouse got up and said,
"I have a plan that seems very simple, but I know it will be successful. All we have to do is hang a bell about the cat's neck. When we hear the bell ringing, we will know immediately that our enemy is coming."
All the mice were much surprised that they had not thought of such a plan before. But in the midst of the rejoicing over their good fortune, an old mouse arose and said, "I will say that the plan of the young mouse is very good, but let me ask one question. Who will bell the cat?" It is one thing to say that something should be done, but quite a different matter to do it. End of Belling the Cat by Aesop. Read by Cathy Snyder.
Clytie by Jean Lang. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The sunbeams are basking on the high walls of the old garden, smiling on the fruit that grows red and golden in their warmth. The bees are humming round the bed of purple heliotrope, and drowsily murmuring in the shelter of the soft petals of the blush roses whose sweetness brings back the fragrance of days that are gone. On the old gray sundial, the white-winged pigeons sleepily croon as they preen their snowy plumage, and the Madonna lilies hang their heads like a procession of white-robed nuns who dare not look up from telling their beads until the triumphal procession of an all-conquering warrior has gone by. What can they think of that long line of tall yellow flowers by the garden wall, who turn their faces sunwards with an arrogant assurance, and give stare for stare to golden-haired Apollo as he drives his blazing car triumphant through the high heavens? Sunflowers is the name by which we know those flamboyant blossoms which somehow fail so wholly to suggest the story of Clytie, the nymph whose destruction came from a faithful, unrequited love. She was a water nymph, a timid, gentle being who frequented lonely streams, and bathed where the blue dragonflies dart across the white water lilies in pellucid lakes. In the shade of the tall poplar trees and the silvery willows she took her midday rest, and feared the hours when the flowers drooped their heads and the rippling water lost its coolness before the fierce glare of the sun. But there came a day when, into the dark pool by which she sat, Apollo the conqueror looked down and mirrored his face. And never more did she hide from the golden-haired god who, from the moment when she had seen in the water of the picture of his radiant beauty, became the lord and master of her heart and soul. All night she awaited his coming, and the dawn saw her looking eastward for the first golden gleams from the wheels of his chariot. All day she followed him with her longing gaze, nor did she ever cease to feast her eyes upon his beauty until the last reflection of his radiance had faded from the western sky. Such devotion might have touched the heart of the sun god, but he had no wish to own a love for which he had not sought. The nymph's adoration irked him. Nor did pity come as love's pale substitute when he marked how, day by day, her face grew whiter and more white, and her lovely form wasted away. For 9 days, without food or drink, she kept her shamed vigil. Only one word of love did she crave. Unexacting in the humility of her devotion, she would gratefully have nourished her hungry heart upon one kindly glance. But Apollo, full of scorn and anger, lashed up his fiery steeds as he each day drove past her, nor deigned for her a glance more gentle than that which he threw on the satyrs as they hid in the dense green foliage of the shadowy woods. Half mocking, Diana said, "In truth, the fairy nymph who throws her heart's treasure at the feet of my golden-locked brother that he may trample on them is coming to look like a faded flower." And as she spoke, the hearts of the other immortal dwellers on Olympus were stirred with pity. "A flower she shall be," they said, "and for all time shall she live, in life that is renewed each year when the earth stirs with the quickening of spring. The long summer days shall she spend forever in fearless worship of the god of her love." And, as they willed, the nymph passed out of her human form, and took the form of a flower, and evermore, the emblem of constancy, does she gaze with fearless ardor on the face of her love. The heart that has truly loved never forgets, but as truly loves on to the close. As the sunflower turns on her god when he sets, the same look that she turned when he rose. Some there are who say that not into the bold-faced sunflower did her metamorphosis take place, but into that purple heliotrope that gives an exquisite offering of fragrance to the sun god when his warm rays touch it. And in the old walled garden, while the bees drowsily hum, and the white pigeons croon, and the dashing sunflower gives Apollo gaze for gaze, and the scent of the mignonette mingles with that of a clove pinks and blush roses, the fragrance of the heliotrope is, above all, worthy incense to be offered upon his altar by the devout lover of a god. End of Clytie by Jean Lang.
Daddy Takes Us to the Garden by Howard R. Garris. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Daddy Takes Us to the Garden, Chapter 1, A New Game. Mother, what can we do now?
Tell us something to play. Please, we want to have some fun.
As Harry and Mabel Blake said this, they walked slowly up the path toward the front porch, on which their mother was sitting one early spring day. The two children did not look very happy. "What can we do?" asked Hal, as he was called more often than Harry.
"There isn't any more fun,"
complained Mabe, to which her name was often shortened. "Oh my!" laughed Mother Blake. "Such a sadness! What doleful faces you both have! I hope they don't freeze so and stay that way. It would be dreadful." "It can't freeze," said Hal. "It's too warm. Daddy told us how cold it had to be to freeze. That thing you tell how cold it is. It has to get down to where it says number 32 before there's ice."
"You mean the thermometer?"
said Mabe. "That's it," agreed Hal. "And look, the shiny thing. Mercury, that's the name of it. The mercury is at 60 now. It can't freeze, Mother." "Well, I'm glad it can't, for I wouldn't want your face to turn into ice the way it looked a little while ago."
"But there is no fun, Mother."
And Mabe, whose face, as had her brother's, had lost its fretful look while they were talking about the thermometer, again seemed cross and unhappy.
"We can't have any fun."
Why don't you play some games?" asked Mrs. Blake, smiling at the two children. "We did," answered Hal. "We tried to play tag, but it's too muddy to run off the paths, and it's no fun staying in one place. We can't play ball, 'cause Mabe can throw like a boy, and I'm not going to play doll with her."
"I didn't ask you to,"
said Mabe quickly.
"I was going to play doll by myself."
"Yes, but You'd want me to be a doctor or something when your doll got sick. You always do." "I should think that would be fun," said Mother Blake. "Why don't you play doll and doctor?" "I'm not going to play doll," declared Hal, and his face looked crosser than ever. "Oh, it isn't nice to talk that way," said his mother. "You ought to be glad if Maeve wanted you to be a doctor for her sick doll. But perhaps you can think of something else, some new game. Just sit down a moment and we'll talk. Then perhaps you'll think of something. I wonder why it is so warm today, and why there is no danger of anything freezing. Not your faces, of course, for I know you wouldn't let that happen. But why is it so warm? Do you know?" "'Cause it's spring," answered Hal. "Everybody knows that." "Oh, no, not everybody," replied his mother. "Your dog Roly-Poly doesn't know it."
"Oh, yes, Mother, I think he does,"
cried Maeve. "He was rolling over and over in the grass today. Even it was all wet like a sponge. Ugh. He never did that in the winter." "Well, perhaps dogs and cats do know when it is spring. The birds do, I'm sure, for then they come up from the south where they have spent the winter and begin to build their nests. So, you think it is warm today because it is spring. Do you, Hal?" "Yes, Mother," he replied. "It's time winter was gone, anyhow, and the trees know it is going to be summer soon, for they are swelling out their buds."
"And after a while there'll be flowers," added Maeve. "Didn't we have fun, Hal, when Daddy took us hunting flowers?"
"Yes, and when he took us to the woods and to see the different kinds of birds," added the little boy. "We had lots of fun then."
"I wish we could have some of that kind of fun now,"
went on Maeve.
"When's Daddy coming home, Mother?"
"Oh, not for quite a while. He has to work and earn money, you know. He has to earn more than ever, now that everything costs so much on account of the war. Daddies don't have a very easy time these days."
"Do mothers?"
asked Maeve, thinking of how she played mother to her dolls. Maybe, she thought, she could make up a new game, pretending how hard it was for dolls' mothers these days. "Well, mothers have to do many things they did not have to do when things to eat and wear did not cost so much," spoke Mother Blake. "We have to make one loaf of bread go almost as far as 2 loaves used to go, and as for clothes, well, I am mending some of yours, Hal, that last year I thought were hardly useful any more, but we must save all we can. So that's why Daddy has to work harder and longer, and why he can't come home Saturday afternoons as early as he used to." It was a Saturday afternoon when Hal and Maeve found so much fault about not having any fun. Almost any other day they would have been in school and have been busy over their lessons, but now they just wanted to play, and they were not having a very jolly time, for they could not think of anything to do, or, at least, they thought they could not. "What makes it spring?" asked Hal, after a bit, as he watched his mother putting a patch on his little trousers. Hal remembered how he tore a hole in them one day sliding down a cellar door.
"Tell us what makes spring, Mother," went on Maeve. "That will be as much fun as playing, I guess."
"The sun makes the spring," said Mrs. Blake. "Spring is one of the 4 seasons. I wonder if you can tell me the others?" "Which one starts?" asked Hal.
"Spring, of course," exclaimed Maeve. "You have to start with something growing, and things grow in spring."
"That is right," said Mrs. Blake. Spring is the beginning of life in the world. When the flowers and birds begin to grow, the flowers from the little buds and the birds from the little eggs. What comes next? Summer, cried Hal. Then's when we can have fun. The ground is dry, so we can play marbles and fly kites, and we can go in swimming and have a long vacation. Summer's the jolly time. It is a time when things grow that start in the spring, said Mother Blake. What comes after summer?
Autumn,
answered Mabe.
Some folks call it fall. Why do they, Mother?
Because the leaves fall from the trees, perhaps. It is a time when the trees and bushes go to sleep, and when most birds fly down to the warm south. What comes after autumn or fall? Christmas, cried Hal. Yes, so it does, laughed Mrs. Blake. And I guess most children would say the same thing. But I meant what season? It's winter, Hal said. Let's see if I know him. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, he recited. 4 seasons, and this is spring. I wish it would hurry up and be summer.
So do I,
agreed Mabe.
You can't have any fun now. It's too wet to go without your rubbers, too cold to go without a coat, and almost too hot to wear one. I like summer best.
And I like fall and winter, said Hal. But let's do something, Mabe. Let's have some fun. What can we do, Mother? And back the children were, just where they started. Why don't you go get Roly-Poly and play with him? Asked Mrs. Blake.
He's gone away. I guess he run down to Daddy's office like he does sometimes,
said Mabe. Let's go down after him, exclaimed Hal. That'll be some fun.
I don't want to,
spoke Mabe.
I'd rather play with my doll.
You never want to do anything I want to play? Complained Hal. Can she come with me after Roly-Poly, Mother? Well, I don't know. Can't you both play something here until Daddy comes home? Why don't you play, beanbag?
We did, but Hal always throws him over my head and I can't reach,
Mabe said. She throws crooked, complained Hal. Oh, my dears, I think you each must have the spring fever, laughed Mother Blake. Try and be nicer toward one another. Let me see now. How would you like to help me bake a cake, Mabe?
Oh, that would be fun.
And Mabe jumped up from the porch where she had been sitting near her mother's rocking chair and began to clap her hands.
May I stir it myself and put the dough in the pans?
Yes, I think so. Pfft, that's no fun for me, remarked Hal. I want to have some fun too.
You may clean out the chocolate or frosting dish, whichever kind of cake we make,
offered Mabe.
You always like to scrape out the chocolate dish, Hal.
Yes, I like that, he said, smiling a little.
Well, you may have it all alone this time if I make the cake,
went on Mabe. Nearly always she and Hal shared this pleasure, that of scraping out with a knife or spoon the chocolate or sugar icing dish from which Mother Blake took the sweet stuff for the top and inside the layers of the cake.
Come on, Hal.
Hal was willing enough now, and soon he and his sister were in the kitchen, helping Mother Blake with her cake making. Though, to tell the truth, Mabe and Mrs. Blake did most of the work. While the three were in the midst of their cake making, into the kitchen rushed the little poodle dog, whirling around, barking and trying to catch his tail. "Oh, Roly-Poly, where have you been?" cried Hal. "Did Daddy come home with you?" "Woof, woof," barked Roly-Poly, which might mean no or yes, just as you happened to listen to his bark. Oh, don't get in my way, Rolly, called Mabe as the little dog danced about in front of her while she was carrying a pan filled with cake dough toward the oven. Look out! Oh, there it goes! Just what Mabe had feared came to pass. She tripped over the poodle dog, and, to save herself from falling, she had to drop the pan of cake dough. Down it fell, right on Roly-Poly's back. Woof, woof, woof. He barked and growled at the same time. Oh, look at him, laughed Hal. He's a regular cake himself. Don't let him run through the house that way, called Mother Blake. He'll get the carpets and furnitures all dough. Get him, Hal. Hal made a grab for the little pet dog and caught him by his tail. This made Roly-Poly howl louder than ever, until Hal, not wishing to hurt his pet, managed to get him in his arms. But of course, this made Hal's waist all covered with cake dough. Never mind, said Mother Blake, as she saw Hal looking at himself in dismay. It will all wash off. Better to have it on your waist than on the carpets. Why, Mabe! What's the matter? For Mabe was crying softly. Oh, my nice cake is all spoiled, she sobbed. Oh no, it isn't, comforted Mother Blake. Only one pan of dough is spilled, and there is plenty more. The kitchen floor can easily be washed, and so can Roly-Poly. Hal, went on his mother, you take the dog up to the bathtub and give him a good scrubbing. He'll like that. Take off your own waist and let the water run in that. I'll wipe up the floor, and you can fill another pan and put it in the oven, Mabe. Don't cry. We'll have the cake in time for supper yet. So Mabe dried her tears and once more began on the cake, while Mrs. Blake cleaned up the dough from the floor. In a little while the cake was baking in the oven, and Hal came downstairs rather wet and splattered, but clean. With him was Roly-Poly, looking half drowned, but also clean. Well, we did a lot of things, said Hal, when he had on dry clothes, and he and Mabe were waiting for the cake to be baked, after which the chocolate would be spread over it. It was fun, wasn't it? I guess so, answered Mabe, not quite sure. Did I hurt Roly when I stepped on him? I guess not. He splashed water all over me when I put him in the bathtub, though. I pretended he was a submarine ship, and he swam all around. I wish I had seen him. I'll make him do it again. And Hal started toward the stairs, with Roly in his arms. Oh, no, please don't, laughed Mother Blake. One bath a day is enough. Besides, I think it's time to take the cake out, Mabe. When the chocolate had been spread on, and Hal had scraped out the dish, giving Mabe a share even though she had said she did not want any, the front door was hard to shut. Here comes Daddy, cried Mabe. Oh, I wonder if he brought anything, said Hal, racing after his sister. Daddy Blake did have a package in his arms, and he was smiling. He put the bundle down on the table and caught up first Mabe and then Hal for a hearty kiss. Well, how are you all today? He asked. I just baked a cake, answered Mabe. And the dough went all over Roly-Poly, and I made him believe he was a submarine ship in the bathtub, added Hal. We had lots of fun. Before that, we didn't thought, spoke Mabe. We wanted to play something new, but we didn't know what. Did you bring us anything, Daddy? Yes, I brought you and Hal a new game. A new game? Oh, goody! Maybe play it now, Well, you can start to look at it now, but it takes quite a while to play it. It takes all spring, all summer, and part of the fall. Oh, what a long game! Cried Hal. What is it? It's called the Garden Game, said Daddy Blake, smiling. And after supper, I'll tell you all about it.
The garden game,
murmured Mabe. It must be fun, said Hal. Else Daddy wouldn't laugh around his eyes the way he does. Yes, I think you'll like this new game, went on Mr. Blake. And whoever learns to play it best will get a fine prize.
Oh!
Cried Hal and Mabe in delight. They could hardly wait to find out all about it. End of Daddy Takes Us to the Garden by Howard R. Garris. Read by aggiepulms.
The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Many years ago, there was an emperor who was so excessively fond of new clothes that he spent all his money in dress. He did not trouble himself in the least about his soldiers, nor did he care to go either to the theater or the chase, except for the opportunities then afforded him for displaying his new clothes. He had a different suit for each hour of the day, and as of any other king or emperor one is accustomed to say he is sitting in council, it was always said of him, the emperor is sitting in his wardrobe. Time passed merrily in the large town which was his capital. Strangers arrived every day at the court. One day, 2 rogues, calling themselves weavers, made their appearance. They gave out that they knew how to weave stuffs of the most beautiful colors and elaborate patterns, the clothes manufactured from which should have the wonderful property of remaining invisible to everyone who was unfit for the office he held, or who was extremely simple in character. These must indeed be splendid clothes, thought the emperor. Had I such a suit, I might at once find out what men in my realms are unfit for their office, and also be able to distinguish the wise from the foolish. This stuff must be woven for me immediately. And he caused large sums of money to be given to both the weavers, in order that they might begin their work directly. So the 2 pretended weavers set up 2 looms, and affected to work very busily, though in reality they did nothing at all. They asked for the most delicate silk and the purest gold thread, put both into their own knapsacks, and then continued to pretend work at the empty looms until late at night. I should like to know how the weavers are getting on with my cloth, said the emperor to himself, after some little time had elapsed. He was, however, rather embarrassed when he remembered that a simpleton, or an unfit for his office, would be unable to see the manufacture. To be sure, he thought he had nothing to risk in his own person, but yet he would prefer sending somebody else to bring him intelligence about the weavers and their work before he troubled himself in the affair. All the people throughout the city had heard of the wonderful property the cloth was to possess, and all were anxious to learn how wise, or how ignorant, their neighbors might prove to be. I will send my faithful old minister to the weavers, said the emperor at last after some deliberation. He will be best able to see how the cloth looks, for he is a man of sense, and no one can be more suitable for his office than he is. So the faithful old minister went into the hall, where the knaves were working with all their might at their empty looms. What can be the meaning of this? Thought the old man, opening his eyes very wide. I cannot discover the least bit of thread on the looms. However, he did not express his thoughts aloud. The impostors requested him very courteously to be so good as to come nearer their looms, and then asked him whether the design pleased him, and whether the colors were not very beautiful, at the same time pointing to the empty frames. The poor old minister looked and looked. He could not discover anything on the looms, for a very good reason, viz., there was nothing there. What? Thought he again. Is it possible that I am a simpleton? I have never thought so myself, and no one must know now if I am so. Can it be that I am unfit for my office? No, that must not be said either. I will never confess that I could not see the stuff. Well, sir minister, said one of the knaves, still pretending to work, you do not say whether the stuff pleases you. Oh, it is excellent, replied the minister, looking at the loom through his spectacles. This pattern and the colors, yes, I will tell the emperor without delay how very beautiful I think them. We shall be much obliged to you, said the impostors, and then they named the different colors and described the pattern of the pretended stuff. The old minister listened attentively to their words, in order that he might repeat them to the emperor, and then the knaves asked for more silk and gold, saying it was necessary to complete what they had begun. However, they put all that was given them into their knapsacks, and continued to work with as much apparent diligence as before at their empty looms. The emperor now sent another officer of his court to see how the men were getting on, and to ascertain whether the cloth would soon be ready. It was just the same with this gentleman as with this minister. He surveyed the looms on all sides, but could see nothing at all but the empty frames. Does not the stuff appear as beautiful to you as it did to my lord the minister? Asked the impostors of the emperor's second ambassador, at the same time making the same gestures as before, and talking of the design and colors which were not there. Certainly not stupid, thought the messenger. It must be that I am not fit for my good profitable office. That is very odd. However, no one shall know anything about it. And accordingly he praised the stuff he could not see, and declared that he was delighted with both colors and patterns. Indeed, please your imperial majesty, he said to his sovereign when he returned, the cloth which the weavers are preparing is extraordinarily magnificent. The whole city was talking of the splendid cloth which the emperor had ordered to be woven at his own expense. And now the emperor himself wished to see the costly manufacture while it was still in the loom. Accompanied by a select number of officers of the court, among whom were the two honest men who had already admired the cloth, he went to the crafty impostors, who, as soon as they were aware of the emperor's approach, went on working more diligently than ever, although they still did not pass a single thread through the looms. Is not the work absolutely magnificent? Said the two officers of the crown already mentioned. If your majesty will only be pleased to look at it, what a splendid design, what glorious colors! And at the same time they pointed to the empty frames, for they imagined that everyone else could see the exquisite piece of workmanship. How is this? Said the emperor to himself. I can see nothing. This is indeed a terrible affair. Am I a simpleton, or am I unfit to be an emperor? That would be the worst thing that could happen. Oh, the cloth is charming, said he aloud. It has my complete admiration. And he smiled most graciously, and looked closely at the empty looms, for on no account would he say that he could not see what two of the officers of his court had praised so much. All his retinue now strained their eyes, hoping to discover something on the looms, but they could see no more than the others. Nevertheless, they all exclaimed, "Oh, how beautiful!" and advised his majesty to have some new clothes made from this splendid material for the approaching procession. Magnificent, charming, excellent, resounded on all sides, and everyone was uncommonly gay. The emperor shared in the general satisfaction, and presented the impostors with the riband of an order of knighthood, to be worn on their buttonholes with the title of gentlemen weavers. The rogues sat up the whole night before the day on which the procession was to take place, and had 16 lights burning, so that everyone might see how anxious they were to finish the emperor's new suit. They pretended to roll the cloth off the looms, cut the air with the scissors, and sewed with needles without any thread in them. "See," cried they at last, "the emperor's new clothes are ready!" And now the emperor, with all the grandees of his court, came to the weavers, and the rogues raised their arms, as if in the act of holding something up, saying, "Here are your majesty's trousers. Here is the scarf. Here is the mantle. The whole suit is as light as a cobweb. One might fancy one has nothing at all on when dressed in it. That, however, is the great virtue of this delicate cloth." "Yes, indeed," said all the courtiers, although not one of them could see anything of this exquisite manufacture. "If your imperial majesty will be graciously pleased to take off your clothes, we will fit on the new suit in front of the looking-glass." The emperor was accordingly undressed, and the rogues pretended to array him in his new suit, the emperor turning around from side to side before the looking-glass. "How splendid his majesty looks in his new clothes, and how well they fit!" everyone cried out. "What a design! What colors! These are indeed royal robes!" "The canopy, which is to be borne over the majesty in the procession, is waiting," announced the chief master of the ceremonies. "I am quite ready," answered the emperor. "Do my new clothes fit well?" asked he, turning himself around and around before the looking-glass, in order that he might appear to be examining his handsome suit. The lords of the bedchamber, who were to carry his majesty's train, felt about on the ground as if they were lifting up the ends of the mantle, and pretended to be carrying something, for they would by no means betray anything like simplicity or unfitness for their office. So now the emperor walked under his high canopy in the midst of the procession, through the streets of his capital, and all the people standing by, and those at the windows cried out, "Oh, how beautiful are our emperor's new clothes! What a magnificent train there is to the mantle, and how gracefully the scarf hangs!" In short, no one would allow that he could not see these much-admired clothes, because in doing so he would have declared himself either a simpleton or unfit for his office. Certainly none of the emperor's various suits had ever made so great an impression as these invisible ones. "The emperor has nothing at all on," said a little child. "Listen to the voice of innocence!" exclaimed his father. And what the child had said was whispered from one to another. "But he has nothing at all on!" at last cried out all the people. The emperor was vexed, for he knew that the people were right, but he thought the procession must go on now, and the lords of the bedchamber took greater pains than ever to appear holding up a train, although, in reality, there was no train to hold. The End of The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Catherine Seeholster.
Jack and the Beanstalk. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Jack and the Beanstalk. There was once upon a time a poor widow who had an only son named Jack and a cow named Milky White. And all they had to live on was the milk the cow gave every morning, which they carried to the market and sold. One morning, Milky White gave no milk, and they didn't know what to do. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" said the widow, wringing her hands. "Cheer up, mother. I'll go and get work somewhere," said Jack. "We've tried that before, and no one would take you," said his mother. "We must sell Milky White, and with the money do something, start a shop or something." "All right, mother. It's market day today, and I'll soon sell Milky White, and then we'll see what we can do." So he took the cow's halter in his hand, and off he starts. He hadn't gone far when he met a funny-looking old man who said to him, "Good morning, Jack." "Good morning to you," said Jack, and wondered how he knew his name. "Well, Jack, and where are you off to?" said the man. "I'm going to market to sell our cow here." "Oh, you look the proper sort of chap to sell cows," said the man. "I wonder if you know how many beans makes 5? "2 in each hand and 1 in your mouth," says Jack, as sharp as a needle. "Right you are," said the man. "And here they are, the very beans themselves." He went on pulling out of his pocket a number of strange-looking beans. "As you are so sharp," says he, "I don't mind doing a swap with you. Your cow for these beans." "Walker," says Jack, "wouldn't you like it?" "Ah, you don't know what these beans are," said the man. "If you plant them overnight, by morning they grow right up to the sky." "Really?" says Jack. "You don't say so." "Yes, that is so. And if it doesn't turn out to be true, you can have your cow back." "Right," says Jack, and hands him over Milky White's halter and pockets the beans. Back goes Jack home, and as he hadn't gone very far, it wasn't dusk by the time he got to his door. "What, you're back, Jack?" said his mother. "I see you haven't got Milky White, so you've sold her? How much did you get for her?" "You'll never guess, Mother," says Jack. No, you don't say so. Good boy. 5 pounds, 10, 15? No, it can't be 20. "I told you you couldn't guess. What do you say to these beans? They're magical. Plant them overnight and—" "What?" says Jack's mother. "Have you been such a fool, such a dolt, such an idiot as to give away my Milky White, the best milker in the parish, and prime beef to boot, for a set of paltry beans? Take that, Jack, take that, take that. And as for your precious beans, here they go out the window. And now off to you to bed. Not a sup shall you drink, and not a bit shall you swallow this very night." So Jack went upstairs to his little room in the attic, and sad and sorry he was, to be sure, as much for his mother's sake as for the loss of his supper. At last he dropped off to sleep. When he woke up, the room looked so funny. The sun was shining into part of it, and yet all the rest was quite dark and shady. So Jack jumped up and dressed himself and went to the window. And what do you think he saw? Why, the beans his mother had thrown out of the window into the garden had sprung up into a big beanstalk, which went up and up and up till it reached the sky. So the man spoke truth after all. The beanstalk grew up quite close past Jack's window, so all he had to do was to open it and give a jump onto the beanstalk, which was made like a big plated ladder. So Jack climbed, and he 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 climbed, till at last he reached the sky. And when he got there, he found a long, broad road going as straight as a dart. So he walked along, and he walked along, and he walked along till he came to a great, big, tall house. And on the doorstep there was a great, big, tall woman. "Good morning, Mum," says Jack, quite polite-like. "Could you be so kind as to give me some breakfast?" For he hadn't had anything to eat, you know, the night before, and was as hungry as a hunter. "It's breakfast you want, is it?" says the great, big, tall woman. "It's breakfast you'll be if you don't move off from here. My man is an ogre, and there's nothing he likes better than boys broiled on toast. You'd better be moving on, or he'll soon be coming." "Oh, please, Mum, do give me something to eat, Mum. I've had nothing to eat since yesterday morning, really and truly, Mum," says Jack. "I may as well be broiled as die of hunger." Well, the ogre's wife wasn't such a bad sort after all. So she took Jack into the kitchen and gave him a hunk of bread and cheese and a jug of milk. But Jack hadn't half finished these when, thump, 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 the whole house began to tremble with the noise of someone coming. "Goodness gracious me! It's my old man," said the ogre's wife. "What on earth shall I do? Here, come quick and jump in here." And she bundled Jack into the oven just as the ogre came in. He was a big ogre, to be sure. At his belt he had 3 calves strung up by the heels, and he unhooked them and threw them down on the table and said, "Oh, here, wife, broil me a couple of these for breakfast." "Ah, what's this I smell?" "Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive, or be he dead, I'll have his bones to grind my bread." "Nonsense, dear," said his wife. "You're dreaming. Or perhaps you smell the scraps of that little boy you liked so much for yesterday's dinner. Here, go you and have a wash and tidy up, and by the time you come back, your breakfast'll be ready for you." So the ogre went off, and Jack was just going to jump out of the oven and run off when the woman told him not to. "Wait till he's asleep," she says. "He always has a snooze after breakfast." Well, the ogre had his breakfast, and after that he goes to a big chest and takes out of it a couple of bags of gold and sits down counting them, till at last his head began to nod, and he began to snore until the whole house shook again. Then Jack crept out on tiptoe from his oven, and as he was passing the ogre, he took one of the bags of gold under his arm, and off he pelters till he came to the beanstalk, and then he threw down the bag of gold, which of course fell into his mother's garden, and then he climbed down and down and down, till at last he got home and told his mother and showed her the gold and said, "Well, mother, wasn't I right about the beans? They really are magical, you see." So they lived on the bag of gold for some time, but at last they came to the end of that. So Jack made up his mind to try his luck once more at the top of the beanstalk. So one fine morning he got up early, and he got onto the beanstalk, and he climbed, and he climbed, and he climbed, and he climbed, till at last he got on the road again, and came to the big, tall house he had been to before. There, sure enough, was the big, tall woman a-standing on the doorstep. "Good morning, Mum," says Jack, as bold as brass. "Could you be so good as to give me something to eat?" "Go away, my boy," said the big, tall woman, "or else my man will eat you up for breakfast. But aren't you the youngster who came here once before? Do you know that very day my man missed one of his bags of gold?" "Well, that's strange, Mum," says Jack. "I dare say I could tell you something about that, but I'm so hungry I can't speak until I've had something to eat." Well, the big, tall woman was that curious that she took him in and gave him something to eat. But he had scarcely begun munching it as slowly as he could when, thump, 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 they heard the giant's footstep, and his wife hid Jack away in the oven. All happened as it did before. In came the ogre as he did before and said, "Fee, fi, fo, fum," and had his breakfast off 3 broiled oxen. Then he said, "Wife, bring me the hen that lays the golden eggs." So she brought it, and the ogre said, "Lay," and it laid an egg all of gold. And then the ogre began to nod his head and to snore till the house shook. Then Jack crept out of the oven on tiptoe and caught hold of the golden hen, and was off before you could say Jack Robinson. But this time the hen gave a cackle which woke the ogre, and just as Jack got out of the house he heard him calling, "Wife, wife, what have you done with my golden hen?" And the wife said, "Why, my dear?" But that was all Jack heard, for he rushed off to the beanstalk and climbed down like a house on fire. And when he got home, he showed his mother the wonderful hen and said, "Lay," to it, and it laid a golden egg every time he said, "Lay." Well, Jack was not content, and it wasn't very long before he determined to have another try at his luck up there at the top of the beanstalk. So one fine morning he got up early and went to the beanstalk, and he climbed and he climbed and he climbed and he climbed till he got to the top. But this time he knew better than to go straight to the ogre's house, and when he got near it, he waited behind a bush till he saw the ogre's wife come out with a pail to get some water, and then he crept to the house and got into the copper. He hadn't been there long when he heard thump, 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 as before, and in come the ogre and his wife. "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman," cried the ogre. "I smell him, wife, I smell him." "Do you, my dearie?" says the ogre's wife. "Then if it's that little rogue that stole your gold and the hen that laid the golden egg, he's sure to have got into the oven." And they both rushed to the oven. But Jack wasn't there, luckily, and the ogre's wife said, "There you are again, with your fee-fi-fo-fum. Why, of course it's the laddie you caught last time that I've broiled you for breakfast. How forgetful I am, and how careless you are, not to tell the difference between a live one and a dead one." So the ogre sat down to breakfast and ate it, but every now and then he would mutter, "Well, I could have sworn," and he'd get up and search the larder and the cupboards and everything and everywhere. Only luckily he didn't think of the copper. After breakfast was over, the ogre called out, "Wife, wife, bring me my golden harp." So she brought it and put it on the table before him. Then he said, "Sing!" And the golden harp sang most beautifully, and it went on singing till the ogre fell asleep and commenced to snore like thunder. Then Jack lifted up the copper lid very quietly and got down like a mouse and crept on his hands and his knees till he got to the table, when he got up and caught hold of the golden harp and dashed with it towards the door. But the harp called out quite loud, "Master, master!" and the ogre woke up just in time to see Jack running off with his harp. Jack ran as fast as he could, and the ogre came rushing after and would soon have caught him, only Jack had a start and dodged him a bit and knew where he was going. When he got to the beanstalk, the ogre was not more than 20 yards away, when suddenly he saw Jack disappear. And when he got to the end of the road, he saw Jack underneath climbing down for dear life. Well, the ogre didn't like trusting himself to such a ladder, and he stood and he waited. So Jack got another start. But just then the harp cried out, "Master, master!" And the ogre swung himself down on the beanstalk, which shook with his weight. Down climbs Jack, and after him climbed the ogre. By this time Jack had climbed down and climbed down and down and down, till he was very nearly home. When he got there, he called out, "Mother, mother, bring me my axe, bring me my axe." And his mother came rushing out with the axe in her hand. But when she came to the beanstalk, she stood stock still with fright, for there she saw the ogre just coming down below the clouds. But Jack jumped down and got hold of the axe and gave a chop at the beanstalk, which cut it in half. The ogre felt the beanstalk shake and quiver, so he stopped to see what was the matter. Then Jack gave it a mighty chop with the axe, and the beanstalk was cut in two and began to topple over. Then the ogre fell down and broke his crown, and the beanstalk came tumbling after. Then Jack showed his mother his golden harp, and what with showing that and selling the golden eggs, Jack and his mother became very rich, and he married, and they lived happily ever after. End of Jack and the Beanstalk.
The Legend of the Nautilus by F.A. Steele. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Long, long ago, when people were not nearly so wise as they are nowadays, when they did not know how many millions of miles away the sun is, but firmly believed the moon to be made of green cheese, there lived a little child, a happy little child, that awoke with the dawn, played all day, and slept all night, just as happy little children ought to do, no matter how wise the world becomes. Now, when it was quite a wee baby, it went to bed so early that it did not know what darkness meant, and used to think people were talking nonsense when they spoke of the silent night. But as it grew older, it naturally became less sleepy and sat up later, until the shadows lengthened, the daylight faded, and the red sun dipped down behind the trees. And at last it sat up so late that it saw the gray twilight creep over the world. And then, one bedtime, the dark mantle of night enfolded the flowers and birds and the little wondering child. At first it was frightened and hid its eyes, but after a time it forgot to be afraid and began, as children will, to ask questions. It would watch with wide open, puzzled eyes until the last glamour had gone from the sky, and then it would turn to its mother and say, "Mother, what becomes of the light when the sun goes out?" But the mother only laughed and bade it not be silly. So it sat silent, but for all that it kept on wondering, till its little head ached where the light went when the sun goes out. It asked the fire, thinking that would be sure to know, as it went out often, and had, besides, a nice ruddy light of its own. But it laughed also, and said it didn't know, and didn't care, since the light always came back when it was wanted. The candle suggested it might go into the snuffers, but the chimney declared it knew nothing unless the light hid in the smoke. "The sun has no smoke," said the child, shaking its head. "I'll ask the sunflower. It must know, since it follows the sun all day." "What becomes of the light when the sun goes out?" echoed the sunflower, tossing its head in a superior way. "Why, what a little stupid you are! The sun never goes out. It goes to another place and comes back next morning." "I know that," persisted the child, "but it is the light, not the sun. Look at that yellow light on the wall. See how it creeps up and up. By and by it will climb into the western sky and disappear. Where does it go?" "Nowhere," cried the sunflower in a pet. "That is the stupidest question I ever heard. The light is nothing." Just at that moment, however, it left her face, and she had to turn her head to follow it. So the conversation came to an end. But the child sat thinking, and this is what it thought. If the sunflower follows the light, it must go somewhere. So that night, as it lay cozy in its little bed, the child plucked up courage to ask the moon, which peeped in upon it kindly through the window. "What becomes of the light when the sun goes out?" echoed the moon, surprised. "Why, it stays, of course. Don't you see it in my face?" "Is that sunlight?" asked the child doubtfully. It looks so cold and pale." "Come up here and feel how warm it is," retorted the moon scornfully. "I can't help your having bat's eyes. I can see it quite plain." Now, in those days, children generally believed what they were told, so the child lay satisfied, telling itself it knew where the light went at last, and wishing it had not bat's eyes, when all of a sudden something dark began to creep over the edge of the moon. "Is there anything the matter, Moon?" it asked anxiously. "It looks as though the light were going." "Nothing, nothing," cried the moon hurriedly. "You are in the way, that is all." But the shadow grew and grew, till at last the moon hung like a dark ball in the heavens, and though the light came back again quickly, the child was no longer satisfied, but lay wondering where the light went when it left the moon. So the next day, when it sat watching the sun dip down behind the trees, it made up its mind to follow the sun as far as it could, and find out what became of the light when it went out. It unlatched the garden gate and ran swiftly down the dusty road, startling the sleepy birds from their nests in the tall hedges, until it came to a forest, where it could only see a glint here and there through the gray, gnarled trees. Redder and redder grew the sky, till, as the child came out upon a rising moor, stretching into the blue distance, the sun was close to the horizon. "I shall be too late, I shall be too late," cried the child breathlessly, as it ran heedless of stones and briars. The light faded from the heather and crept up the little figure with its outstretched hands and backward streaming hair. On and on it ran, with the sunset glow upon its flushed face. "Stay, please stay one moment, dear sun," it pleaded, but in vain. The last gleam died away, and, wearied out with fatigue and disappointment, the child stumbled and fell. But kind Night, who is always so good to the tired children, took the little wanderer in her arms, and sleep whispered dreams as a lullaby, till dawn, peeping from the east, awoke the child, and there was the light once more, claiming the world for its own. All that day the little traveler travelled from east to west, and answered hopefully to the passers-by, "I am going, good people, to find out what becomes of the light when the sun goes out. That is all." But when night came, it was no nearer the horizon than before. So, day after day, the child sped on, till, wearied and flushed, it arrived at last upon the shore of the sea, just as the sun was setting. And lo, a bright ray of rippled light stretched from the horizon, and, ever widening, touched the child's tired feet as it hurried to the brink. "It is the road at last," it cried exultantly, "the road to nowhere." So saying, it ran on and on into the sea, careless of the increasing depth. Then the pitying waves took the little wanderer in their cold hands and laid the child back softly on the beach. "Go home, baby," they said. "The big ocean is not for such as you." "But I only want to find out what becomes of the light when the sun goes out," pleaded the child. "Perhaps you can tell me." "Not we," laughed the waves. "It leaves us and goes somewhere else, though we stretch right over the edge of the world." "Perhaps the sunflower was right after all, and it goes nowhere," thought the child. "I must find out where nowhere is. I will not go back to wander and wander and wander all my life long. So it gathered the shells on the shore, shells that glinted and glowed with many hues, shells that were the tempest's spoil from the quiet depths of the ocean, and bound them together with strands of seaweed until a fragile raft floated on the water. "Do not tempt us, do not tempt us," blabbed the little waves. But the child took no heed and pushed out boldly from the shore. Then the waves laughed kindly. "It is a brave child," they said, "and the raft is pretty." So they let it float on the path of the light, and even the wind caught the child's outstretched arms and streaming hair, and wafted the little seeker from the shore, and the sun sank slowly through the golden sky to the golden horizon. "I shall be in time today," cried the child joyfully, "for the light is close on the path beside me." But even as it spoke, the great yellow orb touched the horizon and lay for one instant reflected in the rippling waves. The next it sank, sank, sank. Then, with a cry, "Oh, wait! Please wait!" the little child sprang from the raft of shells and followed the sun on the road to nowhere. The kind waves carried it to the quiet world in the depths of the sea, where there is no voice, no sound, and the light shines dim through the changeful currents above. And there the spirit of the little child still lives and wonders, as it wondered before, whither the light goes. So, every now and again, when the dainty Nautilus rises through the blue water sky to unfurl its purple sails in this world of ours, the spirit of the little seeker begs for a place in the pearly boat, so that it may try once more to see what becomes of the light when the sun goes out. And that is why the Nautilus is generally seen drifting with all sails set along the ray of rippling light which stretches over the sunset sea from the land of nowhere. End of The Legend of the Nautilus by F.A. Steele. Read by Brian Fullen.
Little Snow White, edited by Captain Edric Vredenberg. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. It was in the middle of winter, when the broad flakes of snow were falling around, that a certain queen sat working at the window, the frame of which was made of fine black ebony. And as she was looking out upon the snow, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell upon it. Then she gazed thoughtfully upon the red drops which sprinkled the white snow, and said, "Would that my little daughter may be as white as that snow, as red as the blood, and as black as the ebony window frame." And so the little girl grew up. Her skin was as white as snow, her cheeks as rosy as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. And she was called Snow White. But this queen died, and the king soon married another wife, who was very beautiful, but so proud that she could not bear to think that anyone could surpass her. She had a magical looking-glass, to which she used to go and gaze upon herself in it, and say, tell me, glass, tell me true, of all the ladies in the land, who is the fairest? Tell me who." And the glass answered, "Thou queen art fairest in the land." But Snow White grew more and more beautiful, and when she was 7 years old, she was as bright as the day, and fairer than the queen herself. Then the glass one day answered the queen when she went to consult it as usual. "Thou queen mayst fair and beauteous be, but Snow White is lovelier far than thee." When she heard this, she turned pale with rage and envy, and calling to one of her servants said, "Take Snow White away into the wide wood, that I may never see her more." Then the servant led her away, but his heart melted when she begged him to spare her life, and he said, "I will not hurt thee, thou pretty child." So he left her by herself. And though he thought it most likely that the wild beasts would tear her to pieces, he felt as if a great weight was taken off his heart when he had made up his mind not to kill her, but leave her to her fate. Then poor Snow White wandered along through the wood in great fear, and the wild beasts roared about her, but none did her any harm. In the evening she came to a little cottage, and went in there to rest herself, for her weary feet would carry her no further. Everything was spruce and neat in the cottage. On the table was spread a white cloth, and there were 7 little plates, with 7 little loaves, and 7 little glasses with wine in them, and knives and forks laid in order, and by the wall stood 7 little beds. Then, as she was very hungry, she picked up a little piece of each loaf, and drank a very little wine out of each glass, and after that she thought she would lie down and rest. So she tried all the little beds, and one was too long, and another was too short, till at last the 7th suited her, and there she laid herself down and went to sleep. Presently in came the masters of the cottage, who were 7 little dwarfs that lived among the mountains, and dug and searched about for gold. They lighted up their 7 lamps, and saw directly that all was not right. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my stool?" The second, "Who has been eating off my plate?" The third, "Who's been picking at my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been meddling with my spoon?" The fifth, "Who has been picking at my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been meddling with my spoon?" The fifth, "Who has been handling my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh, "Who has been drinking my wine?" Then the first looked round and said, "Who has been lying on my bed?" And the rest came running to him, and every one cried out that somebody had been upon his bed. But the 7th saw Snow White, and called upon his brethren to come and see her. And they cried out with wonder and astonishment, and brought their lamps to look at her, and said, "Good heavens, what a lovely child she is!" And they were delighted to see her, and took care not to waken her. And the 7th dwarf slept an hour with each of the other dwarfs in turn, till the night was gone. In the morning Snow White told them all her story, and they pitied her, and said if she would keep all things in order, and cook and wash and knit and spin for them, she might stay where she was, and they would take good care of her. Then they went out all day long to their work, seeking for gold and silver in the mountains, and Snow White remained at home. And they warned her and said, "The queen will soon find out where you are, so take care and let no one in." But the queen, now that she thought Snow White was dead, believed that she was certainly the handsomest lady in the land, and she went to her glass, and the glass answered, "Thou queen, thou art fairest in all this land, but over the hills in the greenwood shade, where the 7 dwarfs their dwellings have made, there Snow White is hiding her head, and she is lovelier far, O queen, than thee." Then the queen was very much alarmed, for she knew that the glass always spoke the truth, and was sure that the servant had betrayed her, and she could not bear to think that anyone lived who was more beautiful than she was. So she disguised herself as a pedlar, and went her way over the hills to the place where the dwarfs dwelt. Then she knocked on the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell." Snow White looked out of the window and cried, "Good day, good woman. What have you to sell?" "Good wares, fine wares," said she, "laces and bobbings of all colours." "I will let the old lady in. She seems to be a very good sort of a body," thought Snow White. So she ran down and unbolted the door. "Bless me," said the woman, "how badly your stays are laced. Let me lace them up with one of my nice new laces." Snow White did not dream of any mischief, so she stood up before the old woman, but she set to work so nimbly and pulled the lace so tight that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if she were dead. "There's an end of all thy beauty," said the spiteful queen, and went away home. In the evening the 7 dwarfs returned, and I need not say how grieved they were to see their faithful Snow White stretched upon the ground motionless, as if she were quite dead. However, they lifted her up, and when they found what was the matter, they cut the lace, and in a little time she began to breathe, and soon came to life again. Then they said, "The old woman was the queen herself. Take care another time, and let no one in when we are away." When the queen got home, she went to her glass and spoke to it, but to her surprise it said the same words as before. Then the blood ran cold in her heart with spite and malice to see that Snow White still lived, and she dressed herself up again in a disguise, but very different from the one she wore before, and took with her a poisoned comb. When she reached the dwarf's cottage, she knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell." But Snow White said, "I dare not let anyone in." Then the queen begged, "Only look at my beautiful combs," and gave her the poisoned one. And it looked so pretty that she took it up and put it into her hair to try it. But the moment it touched her head, the poison was so powerful that she fell down senseless. "There you may lie," said the queen, and went away. But by good luck the dwarfs returned very early that evening, and when they saw Snow White lying on the ground, they thought what had happened, and soon found the poisoned comb. And when they took it away, she recovered, and told them all that had passed, and they warned her once more not to open the door to anyone. Meantime, the queen went home to her glass, and trembled with rage when she received exactly the same answer as before, and she said, "Snow White shall die if it cost me my life." So she went secretly into a chamber and prepared a poisoned apple. The outside looked very rosy and tempting, but whosoever tasted it was sure to die. Then she dressed herself up as a peasant's wife, and travelled over the hills to the dwarf's cottage, and knocked at the door. But Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I dare not let anyone in, for the dwarfs have told me not to." "Do as you please," said the old woman, "but at any rate take this pretty apple. I will make you a present of it." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take it." "You silly girl," answered the other. "What are you afraid of? Do you think it's poisoned? Come, do you eat one part, and I will eat the other." Now the apple was so prepared that one side was good, though the other side was poisoned. Then Snow White was very much tempted to taste, for the apple looked exceedingly nice, and when she saw the old woman eat, she could refrain no longer. but she had scarcely put the piece into her mouth when she fell down dead upon the ground. "This time nothing will save thee," said the queen, and she went home to her glass, and at last it said, "Thou, queen, art the fairest of all the fair." And then her envious heart was glad and as happy as such a heart could be. When evening came, and the dwarfs returned home, they found Snow White lying on the ground. No breath passed her lips, and they were afraid that she was quite dead. They lifted her up and combed her hair and washed her face with wine and water. But all was in vain, for the little girl seemed quite dead. So they laid her down upon a bier, and all seven watched and bewailed her 3 whole days. And then they proposed to bury her. But her cheeks were still rosy, and her face looked just as it did while she was alive. So they said, "We will never bury her in the cold ground." And they made a coffin of glass, so that they might still look at her, and wrote her name upon it in golden letters, and that she was a king's daughter. And the coffin was placed upon the hill, and one of the dwarfs always sat by it and watched. And the birds of the air came too, and bemoaned Snow White. First of all came an owl, and then a raven, but at last came a dove. And thus Snow White lay for a long, long time, and still only looked as though she were asleep. For she was even now as white as snow, and as red as blood, and as black as ebony. At last a prince came and called at the dwarf's house, and he saw Snow White and read what was written in gold letters. Then he offered the dwarfs money, and earnestly prayed them to let him take her away. But they said, "We will not part with her for all the gold in the world." At last, however, they had pity on him, and gave him the coffin. But the moment he lifted it up to carry it home with him, the piece of apple fell from between her lips, and Snow White awoke and said, "Where am I?" And the prince answered, "Thou art safe with me." Then he told her all that had happened, and said, "I love you better than all the world. Come with me to my father's palace, and you shall be my wife." And Snow White consented, and went home with the prince, and everything was prepared with great pomp and splendour for their wedding. To the feast was invited among the rest Snow White's old enemy, the queen. And as she was dressing herself in fine, rich clothes, she looked in the glass, and the glass answered, "Thou, lady, art the loveliest here, I ween, but lovelier far is the new-made queen." When she heard this, she started with rage, but her envy and curiosity were so great that she could not help setting out to see the bride. And when she arrived, and saw that it was none other than Snow White, who she thought had been dead a long while, she choked with passion, and fell ill and died. But Snow White and the prince lived and reigned happily over the land many, many years. End of The Little Snow White, edited by Captain Edric Vredenburg.
The Mice and the Camel by Violet Moore Higgins. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Far, far away, deep in the heart of the forest, in a land seldom visited by travelers, there was once upon a time a strange kingdom called Mousia, or the land of the mice. All the mice in the world either came from this land, or were the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of mice who had been born in Mousia. The mice all lived in neat little homes, quite cosily furnished, even down to the last details, such as pictures on the walls and books on the shelves. There were shops and schools, churches and forts, too, and in the very center of the kingdom there was a capital city with a royal palace. It was tiny but very splendid, and in this wee palace lived King Long Whiskers the First, ruler over all the mice. Although Mousia was such a wonderful little country, and so complete in every way, it was cunningly hidden away from the eyes of men, for the buildings were overshadowed by great ferns and concealed behind big boulders, so that it would have taken a very sharp eye to discover even a single house. Now it happened one day that a caravan, a great train of men and horses and camels, passed through Mousia and encamped nearby. By great good luck, they did not go directly through the center of the little kingdom, and so the public buildings and most of the houses of Mousia were undisturbed. Fortunately, too, none of the mice were injured, for they had been warned by the quivering of the earth as the caravan had advanced, and so had fled to places of safety. But still many, many little homes were entirely crushed to bits, and the amount of rebuilding that had to be done was very discouraging to the mice. Then, too, they did not dare begin until the caravan was far away, for there was danger that it might turn back and once more destroy the houses. Now it chanced that there was a very old camel in the caravan, and he had become sick from overwork and ill treatment. He was blind in one eye, and he limped a little, too, so that he was no longer of much value. His owner felt sure that the camel was going to die, and so, when the caravan moved on from Mousia, the unkind man left the poor beast behind without food or water. But the old camel did not die. A few days of rest and relief from heavy burdens made a big improvement in him, and soon he was able to be up and about. He was ravenously hungry, and began to roam all over Mousia, trampling down many houses, eating away the ferns which hid the buildings, and chewing up the crops of fine short grass which the mice raised as food for the winter. The mice were frightened and worried by this state of things, and began sending complaints to their king. They said that one of the moving mountains had remained, and was destroying houses faster than they could rebuild them. "Furry Ears," said the king to his prime minister, "this cannot go on. Even if this mountain be 100 miles high, he must not eat our gardens and trample our homes. Go to him, and say that I command him to appear before me." Furry Ears obeyed without delay, and sought out the camel. He described his royal master to him as a creature of such power and importance that the great beast permitted himself to be led by his nose-string to the royal palace. He stepped very carefully as he went, so as to avoid further displeasing the great unknown king. But when at last he stood in the presence of the little ruler, he began to show both amusement and scorn. "Poof!" he laughed. "Is that we, might your king? I had thought to face some mighty creature. I would never have come had I known he was such a speck." So saying, he clumped away, tumbling down more houses and eating more crops. But King Long Whiskers felt that he and his people would some day be avenged. He was quite right, too, for only a few days after that the camel's nose-string became entangled in a thorn bush, and he could not get it free, try as he would. He was forced to stand with his head to the ground, and the cruel thorns jabbed him with every move he made. His plight was soon discovered, and the story brought to the king. Attended by his prime minister and court, King Long Whiskers set out for the thorn bush. "You see," he said to the poor prisoner, "you called me a speck, and refused to obey my just commands, or even listen to my words, and now you are being punished." "You are right, O mighty king," the camel answered humbly. "I was in the wrong, and now I am suffering for it. But if you will forgive me and set me free, I swear by my whiskers and my double hump that I will be your faithful servant as long as I shall live." This speech touched the king, and he ordered a number of his mice to set to work at once freeing the camel. One gnawed away the nose string, others pulled out the thorns from his nose, and still others held the branches aside so that he could raise his head. Once freed, the big beast kept his word. He was so powerful that he could carry burdens which seemed impossible to the little mice, and would have required the services of thousands and tens of thousands of them. He would go wherever they commanded, and he lie down patiently while they loaded him with sticks, stones, straws, and all sorts of building material, climbing up his hairy back by means of little rope scaling ladders. With his help, they were able to build great stone walls all around their kingdom, so that they no longer had to fear the attacks of their dreaded enemies, the cats, or their envious neighbors of a nearby country, the rats. So time went on, and every one in Mousia was very comfortable and happy. Then one day came a band of woodcutters to the forest where the tiny kingdom lay hidden under the ferns. There was no way to hide the camel, however, and the woodcutters saw the big beast. They threw a rope around his neck and led him away to their tents, where he was forced to carry wood and water for them. He tried to kick and bite his captors, so that they would set him free, but he received such hard blows for his pains that at last he was forced to submit. He thought sadly of his kind little friends, the mice, and always walked carefully wherever he went, for fear he might step on the hidden home of some mouse farmer who lived outside the walls. When the king of the mice heard the bad news, he was very angry indeed, and he sent Furry Ears to the woodcutters at once with the message that he wished to see them. Surprised and amused, they followed him to where the little king waited in state, surrounded by his court in the public square. They listened gravely to his demand that the camel be returned immediately, but when he had finished speaking, they roared with laughter. "You silly little mouse," they said at last, wiping away the tears that their laughter had brought to their eyes. "Did you really think we would give the camel up to you? If you want it, come and get it." "I will," squeaked the Mouse King in a rage. "I hereby declare war on you and all the people of your village." At that the woodcutters laughed harder than ever, and went away holding their sides, declaring that the Lord Mayor would die of laughter when they told him of the great joke. But King Long Whiskers was in earnest. He had been defied and insulted, and he was thoroughly angry and determined on revenge. Accordingly, he sent out calls to all his subjects, not only in the kingdom, but in the most distant lands, and they trooped home by thousands and tens of thousands, and began marching toward the town of the woodcutters. By day they hid under leaves and bushes, but as night fell they began work. Tunnel after tunnel was burrowed under the town. First they made their way to the treasury, through floors and by digging under walls, and piece by piece they carried away the public money. Then they began nibbling away the foundations of all the buildings in the town, and carrying off loads of dirt from under each place, until at last the city stood on a mere crust of earth, which bridged over a deep black pit. When the king of the mice and his generals and chief engineers were sure that all was in readiness, so that the least shock would destroy the town, they sent a messenger to the camel with a warning. The little mouse ran to where the patient animal lay tied after a long, hard day of toil. "I shall gnaw through your rope," he said, "and when it is quite dark you must get up and steal quietly away to our city. All will be explained to you later." When the little mouse had chewed through the last strand, he was off like a flash. In the meantime, the king and his prime minister had prepared a letter for the mayor of the woodcutters' town, and the mouse generals had been leading their troops far away from the scene of danger. The king's own messenger was the last to leave. He scuttled up the gate-post of the Lord Mayor's own house and dropped King Long Whisker's letter on the steps, where it would surely be seen the first thing next morning. That night, when all the little mice were safely back in their homes, they heard a soft thudding on the ground and knew that their friend, the camel, had come back. So they all went out as quietly as possible to make him welcome. "No explanations now," the prime minister said. "You shall know all tomorrow." And the tired camel, happy to be among his friends once more, settled down comfortably for the night in an open space which had been set aside especially for him, and was known as Camel Park. Early the next morning the letter was found by the Lord Mayor himself. When he saw that it bore the royal seal of King Long Whiskers the First, he felt that the contents would be a rare joke indeed. Hastily he summoned the town council of 50, and when they were seated around the great table in the council chamber, prepared to enjoy a great laugh, he broke the seal and opened the envelope. The letter was very short. The king of the mice had merely repeated his demand that the camel stolen from him should be returned at once, or he would wage war on the town. But the clever little mouse ruler had slipped a generous quantity of snuff between the pages of the letter. As the mayor read the brief message, he began to laugh, and waved the letter gaily around his head. His laughter changed, however, into a choking sneeze. The powder floated out into the air, and in an instant the 50 councillors were all sneezing in 50 different ways. Suddenly the hall quivered. Then there was a great crunching and crackling and crashing of timbers. In an instant more, the thin crust of earth underneath the building broke through, and almost before it can be told, the mayor and the councillors, the town hall, and all the neighboring buildings had tumbled down out of sight into the big black hole. But King Long Whiskers the First and all his subjects and their friend the camel lived long and prospered, and never again was the kingdom of Mousia, in that far-off land, troubled by an enemy. End of The Mice and the Camel by Violet Moore Higgins. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, June 2024.
Millions of Cats by Wanda Gag. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chuck Williamson. Once upon a time, there was a very old man and a very old woman. They lived in a nice clean house, which had flowers all around it, except where the door was. But they couldn't be happy because they were so lonely. "If only we had a cat," sighed the very old woman. "A cat?" asked the very old man. "Yes, a sweet little fluffy cat," said the very old woman. "I will get you a cat, my dear," said the very old man. And he set out over the hills to look for one. He climbed over the sunny hills. He trudged through the cold valleys. He walked a long, long time, and at last he came to a hill which was covered with cats. Cats here, cats there, cats and kittens everywhere. Hundreds of cats, thousands of cats, millions and billions and trillions of cats. "Oh!" cried the old man joyfully. "Now I can choose the prettiest cat and take it home with me." So he chose one. It was white. But just as he was about to leave, he saw another one, all black and white, and it seemed just as pretty as the first. So he took this one also. But then he saw a fuzzy gray kitten way over here, which was every bit as pretty as the others. So he took it too. And now he saw one way down in a corner, which he thought too lovely to leave. So he took this too. And just then, over here, the very old man found a kitten which was black and very beautiful. "It would be a shame to leave that one," said the very old man. So he took it. And now, over there, he saw a cat which had brown and yellow stripes like a baby tiger. "I simply must take it," cried the very old man, and he did. So it happened that every time the very old man looked up, he saw another cat which was so pretty he could not bear to leave it. And before he knew it, he had chosen them all. And so he went back over the sunny hills and down through the cool valleys to show all his pretty kittens to the very old woman. It was very funny to see those hundreds and thousands and millions and billions and trillions of cats following him. They came to a pond. "Mew, mew, we are thirsty," cried the hundreds of cats, thousands of cats, millions and billions and trillions of cats. "Well, here is a great deal of water," said the very old man. Each cat took a sip of water, and the pond was gone. "Mew, mew, now we are hungry," said the hundreds of cats, thousands of cats, millions and billions and trillions of cats. "There is much grass on the hills," said the very old man. Each cat ate a mouthful of grass, and not a blade was left. Pretty soon, the very old woman saw them coming. "My dear," she cried, "what are you doing? I asked for one little cat, and what do I see? Cats here, cats there, cats and kittens everywhere, hundreds of cats, thousands of cats, millions and billions and trillions of cats. But we can never feed them all," said the very old woman. "They will eat us out of house and home." "I never thought of that," said the very old man. "What shall we do?" The very old woman thought for a while, and then she said, "I know. We shall let the cats decide which one we should keep." "Oh, yes," said the very old man, and he called to the cats, "Which one of you is the prettiest?" "I am! I am! No, I am! No, I am the prettiest! I am! No, I am! I am! I am!" cried hundreds and thousands and millions and billions and trillions of voices, for each cat thought itself the prettiest. They bit and scratched and clawed at each other and made such a great noise that the very old man and the very old woman ran into the house as fast as they could. They did not like such quarreling. But after a while the noise stopped, and the very old man and the very old woman peeped out of the window to see what had happened. They could not see a single cat. "I think they must have eaten each other all up," said the very old woman. "It's too bad." "But look," said the very old man, and he pointed to a bunch of high grass. In it sat one little frightened kitten. They went out and picked it up. It was thin and scraggly. "Poor little kitty," said the very old woman. "Dear little kitty," said the very old man. "How does it happen that you were not eaten up with all those hundreds and thousands and millions and billions and trillions of cats?" "Oh, I'm just a very homely little cat," said the kitten. "So when you asked who was the prettiest, I didn't say anything. So nobody bothered about me." They took the kitten into the house, where the very old woman gave it a warm bath, and brushed its fur until it was soft and shiny. Every day they gave it plenty of milk. And soon it grew nice and plump. "And it is a very pretty cat after all," said the very old woman. "It is the most beautiful cat in the whole world," said the very old man. "And I ought to know, for I've seen hundreds of cats, thousands of cats, millions and billions and trillions of cats, and not one was as pretty as this one." End of Millions of Cats by Wanda Gag.
The Owl and the Grasshopper by Aesop. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The owl always takes her sleep during the day. Then, after sundown, when the rosy light fades from the sky and the shadows rise slowly through the wood, out she comes, ruffling and blinking from the old hollow tree. Now her weird hoo, hoo, hoo echoes through the quiet wood, and she begins her hunt for the bugs and beetles, frogs and mice she likes so well to eat. Now, there was a certain old owl who had become very cross and hard to please as she grew older, especially if anything disturbed her daily slumbers. One warm summer afternoon, as she dozed away in her den in the old oak tree, a grasshopper nearby began a joyous but very raspy song. Out popped the old owl's head from the opening in the tree that served her both for door and for window. "Get away from here, sir," she said to the grasshopper. "Have you no manners? You should at least respect my age and leave me to sleep in quiet." But the grasshopper answered saucily that he had as much right to his place in the sun as the owl had to her place in the old oak. Then he struck up a louder and still more rasping tune. The wise old owl knew quite well that it would do no good to argue with the grasshopper, nor with anybody else for that matter. Besides, her eyes were not sharp enough by day to permit her to punish the grasshopper as he deserved. So she laid aside all hard words and spoke very kindly to him. "Well, sir," she said, "if I must stay awake, I am going to settle right down to enjoy your singing. Now that I think of it, I have a wonderful wine here, sent me from Olympus, of which I am told Apollo drinks before he sings to the high gods. Please come up and taste this delicious drink with me. I know it will make you sing like Apollo himself." The foolish grasshopper was taken in by the owl's flattering words. Up he jumped to the owl's den, But as soon as he was near enough so the old owl could see him clearly, she pounced upon him and ate him up. Flattery is not a proof of true admiration. Do not let flattery throw you off your guard against an enemy. End of The Owl and the Grasshopper by Aesop. Read by Jennifer Fournier.
Rumpelstiltskin by the Brothers Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. By the side of a wood, in the country a long way off, ran a fine stream of water, and upon the stream there stood a mill. The miller's house was close by, and the miller, who you must know, had a very beautiful daughter. She was, moreover, very shrewd and clever, and the miller was so proud of her that he one day told the king of the land, who used to come and hunt in the wood, that his daughter could spin gold out of straw. Now this king was very fond of money, and when he heard the miller's boast his greediness was raised, and he sent for the girl to be brought before him. Then he led her to a chamber in his palace, where there was a great heap of straw, and gave her a spinning wheel, and said, "All this must be spun into gold before morning, as you love your life." It was in vain that the poor maiden said that it was only a silly boast of her father, for that she could do no such thing as spin straw into gold. The chamber door was locked, and she was left alone. She sat down in one corner of the room, and began to bewail her hard fate, when on a sudden the door opened, and a droll-looking little man hobbled in, and said, "Good morning to you, my good lass. What are you weeping for?" "Alas," she said, "I must spin the straw into gold, and I know not how." "What will you give me," said the hobgoblin, "to do it for you?" "My necklace," replied the maiden. He took her at her word, and sat himself down to the wheel, and whistled and sang, round about, lo and behold, reel away, straw into gold." And round about the wheel went merrily. The work was quickly done, and the straw was all spun into gold. When the king came and saw this, he was greatly astonished and pleased, but his heart grew still more greedy of gain, and he shut up the poor miller's daughter again with a fresh task. Then she knew not what to do, and sat down once more to weep. But the dwarf soon opened the door, and said, "What will you give me to do your task?" "The ring on my finger," said she. So her little friend took the ring, and began to work at the wheel again, and whistled and sang, round about, lo and behold, reel away, straw into gold, till long before morning all was done again. The king was greatly delighted to see all the glittering treasure, but still he had not enough. So he took the miller's daughter to yet a larger heap, and said, "All this must be spun tonight, and if it is, you shall be my queen." As soon as she was alone, that dwarf came back in and said, "What will you give me to spin gold for you this third time?" "I have nothing left," she said. "Then say you will give me," said the little man, "the first little child that you may have when you are queen." "That may never be," thought the miller's daughter. And as she knew no other way to get her task done, she said she would do what he asked. Round went the wheel again to the old song, and the mannikin once more spun the heap into gold. The king came in the morning, and finding all he wanted, was forced to keep his word. So he married the miller's daughter, and she really became queen. At the birth of her first little child, she was very glad, and forgot about the dwarf and what she had said. But one day he came into her room where she was sitting playing with her baby, and put her in mind of it. Then she grieved sorely at her misfortune, and said she would give him all the wealth of the kingdom if he would let her off, but in vain, till at last her tears softened him, and he said, "I will give you 3 days' grace, and if during that time you tell me my name, you shall keep your child." Now the queen lay awake all night, thinking of all the odd names that she had ever heard, and she sent messengers all over the land to find out new ones. The next day the little man came, and she began with Timothy, Ichabod, Benjamin, Jeremiah, and all the names she could remember. But to all and each of them he said, "Madame, that is not my name." The second day she began with all the comical names she could hear of: Bandy-legs, Hunchback, Crookshanks, and so on. But the little gentleman still said to every one of them, "Madame, that is not my name." The third day one of the messengers came back and said, "I have traveled 2 days without hearing of any other names, but yesterday, as I was climbing a high hill among the trees of the forest where the fox and the hare bid each other good night, I saw a little hut, and before the hut burnt a fire, and around about the fire a funny little dwarf was dancing upon one leg and singing, 'Merrily the feast I'll make, tomorrow I'll brew, tomorrow bake, merrily I'll dance and sing, for next day will a stranger bring. Little does my lady dream, Rumpelstiltskin is my name.' When the queen heard this, she jumped for joy, and as soon as her little friend came, she sat down upon her throne, and called all her court round to enjoy the fun. And the nurse stood by her side with the baby in her arms, as if it was quite ready to be given up. Then the little man began to chuckle, and thought of having the poor child to take home with him to his hut in the woods, and he cried out, "Now, lady, what is my name?" "Is it John?" she asked. "No, madam." "Is it Tom?" "No, madam." "Is it Jeremy?"
"It is not."
"Can your name be Rumpelstiltskin?" said the lady slyly.
"Some witch told you that."
"Some witch told you that," cried the little man, and dashed his right foot in a rage so deep into the floor that he was forced to lay hold of it with both hands to pull it out. Then he made the best of his way off, while the nurse laughed and the baby crowed, and all the court jeered at him for having had so much trouble for nothing, and said, "We wish you a very good morning, and a merry feast, Mr. Rumpelstiltskin." The end of Rumpelstiltskin, recorded for you by Catherine Seeholster. The Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. There was once a little girl who was very pretty and delicate, but in summer she was forced to run around with bare feet, she was so poor, and in winter wear very large wooden shoes, which made her little insteps quite red, and that looked so dangerous. In the middle of the village lived old Dame Shoemaker. She sat and sewed together, as well as she could, a little pair of shoes out of old red strips of cloth. They were very clumsy, but it was a kind thought. They were meant for the little girl. The little girl was called Karen. On the very day her mother was buried, Karen received the red shoes, and wore them for the first time. They were certainly not intended for mourning, but she had no others, and with stockingless feet she followed the poor straw coffin in them. Suddenly a large old carriage drove up, and a large old lady sat in it. She looked at the little girl, felt compassion for her, and then said to the clergyman, "Here, give me the little girl. I will adopt her." And Karen believed all this happened on account of the red shoes. But the old lady thought they were horrible, and they were burnt. But Karen herself was cleanly and nicely dressed. She must learn to read and sew, and people said she was a nice little thing. But the looking-glass said, "Thou art more than nice. Thou art beautiful." Now the queen once traveled through the land, and she had her little daughter with her, and this little daughter was a princess, and people streamed to the castle, and Karen was there also, and the little princess stood in her fine white dress in a window, and let herself be stared at. She had neither a train nor a golden crown, but splendid morocco shoes. They were certainly far handsomer than those Dame Shoemaker had made for the little Karen. Nothing in the world can be compared with red shoes. Now Karen was old enough to be confirmed. She had new clothes and was to have new shoes also. The rich shoemaker in the city took the measure of her little foot. This took place at his house, in his room, where stood large glass cases filled with elegant shoes and brilliant boots. All this looked charming, but the old lady could not see well, and so had no pleasure in them. In the midst of the shoes stood a pair of red ones, just like those the princess had worn. How beautiful they were! The shoemaker said also they had been made for the child of a count, but had not fitted. "That must be patent leather," said the old lady. "They shine so." "Yes, they shine," said Karen, and they fitted and were bought. But the old lady knew nothing about their being red, else she would never have allowed Karen to have gone in red shoes to be confirmed, yet such was the case. Everybody looked at her feet when she stepped through the chancel door at the church pavement. It seemed to her as if the old figures on the tombs were portraits of old preachers and preachers' wives, with stiff ruffs and long black dresses, fixed their eyes on her red shoes, and she thought only of them as the clergyman laid his hand upon her head and spoke of the holy baptism, of the covenant with God, and how she should be a mature Christian. And the organ pealed so solemnly, the sweet children's voices sang, and the old music directors sang. But Karen only thought of her red shoes. In the afternoon, the old lady heard from everyone that the shoes had been red, and she said that was very wrong of Karen, that it was not at all becoming, and that in future Karen should only go in black shoes to church, even when she should be older. The next Sunday there was the sacrament, and Karen looked at the black shoes, looked at the red ones, looked at them again, and put on the red shoes. The sun shone gloriously. Karen and the old lady walked along the path through the corn. It was rather dusty there. At the church door stood an old soldier with a crutch, and with a wonderfully long beard, which was more red than white, and he bowed to the ground, and asked of the old lady whether he might dust her shoes, and Karen stretched out her little foot. "See, what beautiful dancing shoes," said the soldier. "Sit firm when you dance." And he put his hand out towards the soles, and the old lady gave the soldier alms, and went to the church with Karen. And all the people in the church looked at Karen's red shoes, and all the pictures, and as Karen knelt before the altar, and raised the cup to her lips, she only thought of her red shoes, and they seemed to swim in it. And she forgot to sing her psalm, and she forgot to pray, "Oh, Father in heaven!" Now all the people went out of church, and the old lady got into her carriage. Karen raised her foot to get in after her, when the old soldier said, "Look what beautiful dancing shoes!" And Karen could not help dancing a step or two, and when she began, her feet continued to dance. It was just as though the shoes had power over them. She danced around the church corner. She could not leave off. The coachman was obliged to run after and catch hold of her, and he lifted her in the carriage, but her feet continued to dance, so that they trod on the old lady dreadfully. At length she took the shoes off, and then her legs had peace. The shoes were placed in a closet at home, but Karen could not avoid looking at them. Now the old lady was sick, and it was said she could not recover. She must be nursed and waited upon, and there was no one whose duty it was so much as Karen's. But there was a great ball in the city, to which Karen was invited. She looked at the old lady, who could not recover. She looked at the red shoes, and she thought there could be no sin in it. She put on the red shoes. She might do that also, she thought, But then she went to the ball and began to dance. When she wanted to dance to the right, the shoe would dance to the left. And when she wanted to dance up the room, the shoes danced back again, down the steps, into the street, and out of the city gate. She danced and was forced to dance straight into the gloomy wood. Then it was suddenly light up among the trees, and she fancied it must be the moon, for there was a face, but it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there, nodding his head, and said, "Look what beautiful dancing shoes." Then she was terrified, and wanted to fling off the red shoes, but they clung fast, and she pulled down her stockings, but the shoes seemed to have grown to her feet. And she danced, and must dance, over fields and meadows, in rain and sunshine, by night and day. But at night it was the most fearful. She danced over the churchyard, but the dead did not dance. They had something better to do than dance. She wished to seat herself on the poor man's grave, where the bitter tansy grew, but for her there was neither peace nor rest. And when she danced towards the open church door, she saw an angel standing there. He wore long white garments. He had wings which reached from his shoulders to the earth. His countenance was severe and grave, and in his hand he held a sword, broad and glittering. "Dance shalt thou," he said, "dance in thy red shoes till thou art pale and cold, till thy skin shrivels up, and thou art a skeleton. Dance shalt thou from door to door, and where proud, vain children dwell, thou shalt knock, that they may hear thee and tremble. Dance shalt thou." "Mercy!" cried Catherine, but she did not hear the angel's reply, for the shoes carried her through the gate, into the fields, across the roads and bridges, and she must keep ever dancing. One morning she danced past a door which was well new. Within sounded a psalm. A coffin decked with flowers was borne forth. Then she knew that the old lady was dead, and felt that she was abandoned by all, and condemned by the angel of God. She danced, and she was forced to dance through the gloomy night. The shoes carried her over stack and stone. She was torn till she bled. She danced over the heath till she came to a little house. Here she stood, dwelt the executioner. And she tapped with her finger at the window and said, come out, I cannot come in, for I am forced to dance." And the executioner said, "Thou dost not know who I am, I fancy. I strike bad people's heads off, and I hear that my axe rings." "Don't strike my head off," said Catherine. "Then I can't repent of my sins, but strike off my feet and the red shoes." And then she confessed her entire sin, and the executioner struck off her feet with the red shoes, but the shoes danced away, and the little feet across the field into the deep wood. And he carved out little wooden feet for her, and crutches, taught her the psalm criminals always sing, and she kissed the hand which had wielded the axe, and went over to the hearth. "Now I have suffered enough for these red shoes," she said. "Now I will go into the church, that people may see me." And she hastened towards the church door, but when she was near it, the red shoes danced before her, and she was terrified and turned around. The whole week she was unhappy, and wept many bitter tears. But when Sunday returned, she said, "Well, now I have suffered and struggled enough. I really believe I am as good as many one who sits on the church and holds her head so high." And away she went boldly. But she had not gotten farther than the churchyard gate before she saw the red shoes dancing before her, and she was frightened and turned back, and repented of her sin from her heart. And she went to the parsonage and begged that they would take her into service. She would be very industrious, she said, and would do everything she could. She did not care about the wages. She only wished to have a home and be with good people. And so the clergyman's wife was sorry for her and took her into service. And she was industrious and thoughtful. She sat still and listened when the clergyman read the Bible in the evenings, and the children thought a great deal of her. But when they spoke of dress and grandeur and beauty, she shook her head. The following Sunday, when the family was going to church, they asked her whether she would not go with them, but she glanced sorrowfully with tears in her eyes at her crutches. The family went to hear the word of God, but she went alone into her little chamber. There was only room for a bed and a chair to stand in, and here she sat down with her prayer book, and whilst she read, with a pious mind, the wind bore the strains of the organ toward her, and she raised her tearful countenance and said, "Oh, God, help me!" And the sun shone so clearly, and straight before her stood the angel of God in white garments, the same she had seen that night at the church door. But he no longer carried the sharp sword, but in its stead a splendid green spray full of roses. And he touched the ceiling with the spray, and the ceiling rose so high, and where he had touched it there gleamed a golden star. And he touched the walls, and they widened out, and she saw the organ which was playing. She saw the old pictures of the preachers and the preachers' wives. The congregation sat in cushioned seats and sang out their prayer books, for the church itself had come to the poor girl in her narrow chamber, or else she had come into the church. She sat in a pew with the clergyman's family, and when they had ended the psalm and looked up, they nodded and said, "It is right that thou art come." "It was through mercy," she said. And the organ pealed, and the children's voices in the choir sounded so sweet and soft. The clear sunshine streamed so warmly through the window into the pew where Karen sat. Her heart was so full of sunshine, peace, and joy that it broke. Her soul flew on the sunshine to God, and there no one asked after her red shoes. The end of The Red Shoes, read to you by Catherine C. Holster.
The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now, run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane together to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, who should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened, but he rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one shoe among the cabbages, and the other amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether, if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net, and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears. But his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve which he intended to pop on top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. He rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed, "Kitty-shoo!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large bee in her mouth she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it was best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him, till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what she had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I'm sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 teaspoonful to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. End of The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Read by aggiepulms.
The 12 Months, a Slav legend, adapted by Alexander Chotsko. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. There was once a widow who had 2 daughters, Helen, her own child by her dead husband, and Marukla, his daughter by his first wife. She loved Helen, but hated the poor orphan because she was far prettier than her own daughter. Marukla did not think about her good looks and could not understand why her stepmother should be angry at the sight of her. The hardest work fell to her share. She cleaned out the rooms, cooked, washed, sewed, spun, wove, brought in the hay, milked the cow, and all this without any help. Helen, meanwhile, did nothing but dress herself in her best clothes and go to one amusement after another. But Marouckla never complained. She bore the scoldings and bad temper of mother and sister with a smile on her lips and the patience of a lamb. But this angelic behavior did not soften them. They became even more tyrannical and grumpy, for Marouckla grew daily more beautiful, while Helen's ugliness increased. So the stepmother determined to get rid of Marouckla, for she knew that while she remained, her own daughter would have no suitors. Hunger, every kind of privation, abuse, every means was used to make the girl's life miserable. But in spite of it all, Marouckla grew ever sweeter and more charming. One day, in the middle of winter, Helen wanted some wood violets. "Listen," she cried to Marouckla, "you must go up the mountain and find me violets. I want some to put in my gown. They must be fresh and sweet-scented. Do you hear?" "But my dear sister, whoever heard of violets blooming in the snow?" said the poor orphan. "You wretched creature, do you dare to disobey me?" said Helen. "Not another word. Off with you. If you do not bring me some violets from the mountain forest, I will kill you." The stepmother also added her threats to those of Helen, and with vigorous blows they pushed Marouckla outside and shut the door upon her. The weeping girl made her way to the mountain. The snow lay deep, and there was no trace of any human being. Long she wandered hither and thither and lost herself in the wood. She was hungry and shivered with cold and prayed to die. Suddenly, she saw a light in the distance and climbed toward it till she reached the top of the mountain. Upon the highest peak burned a large fire, surrounded by 12 blocks of stone on which sat 12 strange beings. Of these, the first 3 had white hair. 3 were not quite so old, 3 were young and handsome, and the rest still younger. There they all sat, looking at the fire. They were the 12 months of the year. The great January was placed higher than the others. His hair and mustache were white as snow, and in his hand he held a wand. At first, Marouckla was afraid, but after a while her courage returned, and drawing near, she said, "Men of God, may I warm myself at your fire? I am chilled by the winter cold." The great January raised his head and answered, "What brings thee here, my daughter? What dost thou seek?" "I am looking for violets," replied the maiden. "This is not the season for violets. Dost thou not see the snow everywhere?" said January. "I know well, but my sister Helen and my stepmother have ordered me to bring them violets from your mountain. If I return without them, they will kill me. I pray you, good shepherds, tell me where they may be found." Here the great January arose and went over to the youngest of the months, and, placing his wand in his hand, said, "Brother March, do thou take the highest place." March obeyed, and at the same time waving his wand over the fire. Immediately the flames rose toward the sky. The snow began to melt, and the trees and shrubs to bud. The grass became green, and from between its blades peeped the pale primrose. It was spring, and the meadows were blue with violets. "Gather them quickly, Marouckla," said March. Joyfully, she hastened to pick the flowers, and having soon a large bunch, she thanked them and ran home. Helen and the stepmother were amazed at the sight of the flowers, the scent of which filled the house. "Where did you find them?" asked Helen. "Under the trees on the mountainside," said Marouckla. Helen kept the flowers for herself and her mother. She did not even thank her stepsister for the trouble she had taken. The next day she desired Marouckla to fetch strawberries. "Run," said she, "and fetch me strawberries from the mountain. They must be very sweet and ripe." "But whoever heard of strawberries ripening in the snow?" exclaimed Marouckla. "Hold your tongue, worm. Don't answer me. If I don't have my strawberries, I will kill you," said Helen. Then the stepmother pushed Marouckla into the yard and bolted the door. The unhappy girl made her way toward the mountain and to the large fire round which sat the 12 months. The great January occupied the highest place. "Men of God, may I warm myself at your fire? The winter cold chills me," said she, drawing near. The great January raised his head and asked, "Why comest thou here? What dost thou seek?" "I am looking for strawberries," said she. "We are in the midst of winter," replied January. "Strawberries do not grow in the snow." "I know," said the girl sadly, "but my sister and stepmother have ordered me to bring them strawberries. If I do not, they will kill me. Pray, good shepherds, tell me where to find them." The great January arose, crossed over to the month opposite him, and putting the wand in his hand, said, "Brother June, do thou take the highest place." June obeyed, and as he waved his wand over the fire, the flames leaped toward the sky. Instantly the snow melted. The earth was covered with verdure. Trees were clothed with leaves. Birds began to sing, and various flowers blossomed in the forest. It was summer. Under the bushes, masses of star-shaped flowers changed into ripening strawberries, and instantly they covered the glade, making it look like a sea of blood. "Gather them quickly, Marouckla," said June. Joyfully she thanked the months, and having filled her apron, ran happily home. Helen and her mother wondered at seeing the strawberries, which filled the house with their delicious fragrance. "Wherever did you find them?" asked Helen crossly. "Right up the mountains. Those from under the beech trees are not bad," answered Marouckla. Helen gave a few to her mother and ate the rest herself. Not one did she offer to her stepsister. Being tired of strawberries, on the third day she took a fancy for some fresh red apples. "Run, Marouckla," said she, "and fetch me fresh red apples from the mountain." "Apples in winter, sister? Why, the trees have neither leaves nor fruit." "Idle thing, go this minute," said Helen. "Unless you bring back apples, we will kill you." As before, the stepmother seized her roughly and turned her out of the house. The poor girl went weeping up the mountain, across the deep snow, and on toward the fire round which were the 12 months. Motionless they sat there, and on the highest stone was the great January. "Men of God, may I warm myself at your fire? The winter cold chills me," said she, drawing near. The great January raised his head. "Why comest thou here? What dost thou seek?" asked he. I am come to look for red apples, replied Marouckla. But this is winter, and not the season for red apples, observed the great January. I know, answered the girl, but my sister and stepmother sent me to fetch red apples from the mountain. If I return without them, they will kill me. Thereupon the great January arose and went over to one of the elderly months, to whom he handed the wand, saying, Brother September, dost thou take the highest place? September moved to the highest stone and waved his wand over the fire. There was a flare of red flames. The snow disappeared, but the fading leaves, which trembled on the trees, were sent by a cold northeast wind in yellow masses to the glade. Only a few flowers of autumn were visible. At first, Marouckla looked in vain for red apples. Then she espied a tree which grew at a great height, and from the branches of this hung the bright red fruit. September ordered her to gather some quickly. The girl was delighted and shook the tree. First one apple fell, then another. That is enough, said September. Hurry home. Thanking the months, she returned joyfully. Helen and the stepmother wondered at seeing the fruit. Where did you gather them? Asked the stepsister. There are more on the mountain top, answered Marouckla. Then why did you not bring more? Asked Helen angrily. You must have eaten them on your way back, you wicked girl. No, dear sister, I have not even tasted them, said Marouckla. I shook the tree twice. One apple fell each time. Some shepherds would not allow me to shake it again, but told me to return home. Listen, mother, said Helen, give me my cloak. I will fetch some apples myself. I shall be able to find the mountain and the tree. The shepherds may cry, Stop! But I will not leave go till I have shaken down all the apples. In spite of her mother's advice, she wrapped herself in her pelisse, put on a warm hood, and took the road to the mountain. Snow covered everything. Helen lost herself and wandered hither and thither. After a while, she saw light above her and, following in its direction, reached the mountain top. There was the flaming fire, the 12 blocks of stone, and the 12 months. At first, she was frightened and hesitated. Then she came near and warmed her hands. She did not ask permission, nor did she speak one polite word. What hath brought thee here? What dost thou seek? Said the great January severely. I am not obliged to tell you, old graybeard. What business is it of yours? She replied disdainfully, turning her back on the fire and going toward the forest. The great January frowned and waved his wand over his head. Instantly, the sky became covered with clouds. The fire went down, snow fell in large flakes, an icy wind howled around the mountain. Amid the fury of the storm, Helen stumbled about. The pelisse failed to warm her benumbed limbs. The mother kept on waiting for her. She looked from the window. She watched from the doorstep. But her daughter came not. The hours passed slowly. But Helen did not return. Can it be that the apples have charmed her from her home? Thought the mother. Then she clad herself in hood and pelisse and went in search of her daughter. Snow fell in huge masses. It covered all things. For long she wandered hither and thither. The icy northeast wind whistled in the mountains, but no voice answered her cries. Day after day, Marouckla worked and prayed and waited, but neither stepmother nor sister returned. They had been frozen to death on the mountain. The inheritance of a small house, a field, and a cow fell to Marouckla. In course of time, an honest farmer came to share them with her, and their lives were happy and peaceful. End of the 12 Months, adapted by Alexander Chodzko. Read for Librivox by Mireille Davis.
The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It was lovely summer weather in the country, and the golden corn, the green oats, and the haystacks piled up in the meadows looked beautiful. The stork, walking about on his long red legs, chattered in the Egyptian language which he had learnt from his mother. The cornfields and meadows were surrounded by large forests, in the midst of which were deep pools. It was indeed delightful to walk about the country. In a sunny spot stood a pleasant old farmhouse, close by a deep river, and from the house down to the waterside grew great burdock leaves so high that under the tallest of them a little child could stand upright. The spot was as wild as the center of a thick wood. In this snug retreat sat a duck on her nest, watching for her young brood to hatch. She was beginning to get tired of her task, for the little ones were a long time coming out of their shells, and she seldom had any visitors. The other ducks liked much better to swim about in the river than to climb the slippery banks and sit under a burdock leaf to have a gossip with her. At length one shell cracked, and then another, and from each egg came a living creature that lifted its head and cried, "Peep, peep!" "Quack, quack," said the mother, and then they all quacked as well as they could, and looked about them on every side of the large green leaves. Their mother allowed them to look as much as they liked, because green is good for the eyes. "How large the world is!" said the young ducks, when they found how much more room they had than while they were inside the eggshell. "Do you imagine this is the whole world?" asked the mother. "Wait till you have seen the garden. It stretches far beyond that to the parson's field, but I have never ventured to such a distance. Are you all out?" she continued, rising. "No, I declare, the largest egg lies there still. I wonder how long this is to last. I am quite tired of it," and she seated herself again on the nest. "Well, how are you getting on?" asked an old duck who paid her a visit. "One egg is not hatched yet," said the duck. "It will not break, but just look at all the others. Are they not the prettiest little ducklings you ever saw? Ah, they are the image of their father, who is so unkind he never comes to see." "Let me see the egg. That will not break," said the duck. "I have no doubt it's a turkey's egg. I was persuaded to hatch some once, and after all my care and trouble with the young ones, they were afraid of the water. I quacked and clucked, but to no purpose. I could not get them to venture in. Let me look at the egg. Yes, that's a turkey egg. Take my advice, leave it where it is, and teach the other children to swim." "I think I will sit on it a little time longer," said the duck. "So I have sat so long already. A few days will mean nothing." "Please yourself," said the old duck, and she went away. At last the large egg broke, and a young one crept forth, crying, "Peep, peep!" It was very large and ugly. The duck stared at it and exclaimed, "It is very large, and not at all like the others. I wonder if it really is a turkey. We shall soon find out, however, when we go to the water. It must go in if I have to push it myself." On the next day the weather was delightful, and the sun shone brightly on the green burdock leaves. So the mother duck took her young brood down to the water and jumped in with a splash. "Quack, quack!" cried she, and one after another the little ducklings jumped in. The water closed over their heads, but they came up again in an instant, and swam about quite prettily, with their legs paddling under them as easily as possible, and the ugly duckling was also in the water, swimming with them. "Oh," said the mother, "this is not a turkey. How well he uses his legs, and how upright he holds himself. He is my own child, and he is not so very ugly after all, if you look at him properly. Quack, quack! Come with me now. I will take you into grand society and introduce you to the farmyard. But you must keep close to me, or you may be trodden upon, and, above all, beware the cat." When they reached the farmyard, there was a great disturbance. 2 families were fighting for an eel's head, which, after all, was carried off by the cat. See, children, that is the way of the world, and the mother duck wetting her beak, for she would have liked the eel's head herself. "Come now, use your legs, and let me see how well you can behave. You must bow your heads prettily to that old duck yonder. She is the highest born of them all, and has Spanish blood, therefore she is well off. Don't you see she has a red flag tied to her leg, which is something very grand, and a great honor for a duck? It shows that every one is anxious not to lose her, as she can be recognized both by men and beast. Come now, don't turn your toes. A well-bred duckling spreads his feet wide apart, just like his father and mother. In this way, now, bend your neck and say quack." The ducklings did as they were bid, but the other ducks stared and said, "Look, here comes another brood. If I were not enough for us already. And what a queer-looking object one of them is. We don't want him here." And then one flew out and bit him in the neck. "Let him alone," said the mother. "He's not doing any harm."
"Yes, but he's so big and ugly," said the spiteful duck, "and therefore he must be turned out."
"The others are very pretty children," said the old duck with the rag on her leg. "All but that one. I wish his mother could improve him a little." "That's impossible, your grace," replied the mother. "He is not pretty, but he has a very good disposition, and swims as well or even better than the others. I think he will grow up pretty, and perhaps be smaller. He has remained too long in the egg, and therefore his figure is not properly formed." And then she stroked his neck and soothed the feathers, saying, "It is a drake, and therefore not of so much consequence. I think he will grow up strong and be able to take care of himself." "The other ducklings are graceful enough," said the old duck. "Now make yourself at home, and if you can find an eel's head, you can bring it to me." And so they made themselves comfortable. But the poor duckling, who had crept out of his shell last of all, and looked so ugly, was bitten and pushed and made fun of, not only by the ducks, but by all the poultry.
"He's too big,"
they all said, and the turkey cock, who had been born into the world with spurs, and fancied himself really an emperor, puffed himself out like a vessel in full sail, and flew at the duckling, and became quite red in the head with passion, so that the poor little thing did not know where to go, and was quite miserable because he was so ugly, and laughed at by the whole farmyard. So it went on from day to day till it got worse and worse. The poor duckling was driven about by every one. Even his brothers and sisters were unkind to him, and would say,
"Ah, you ugly creature, I wish the cat would get you."
And his mother said she wished he'd never been born. The ducks pecked at him, the chickens beat him, and the girl who fed the poultry kicked him with her feet. So at last he ran away. frightening the little birds in the hedges as he flew over the palings. "They are afraid of me because I'm ugly," he said. So he closed his eyes and flew still further, until he came out on a large moor, inhabited by wild ducks. Here he remained the whole night, feeling very tired and sorrowful. In the morning, when the wild ducks rose in the air, they stared at their new comrade. "What sort of duck are you?" they said, coming around him. He bowed to them and was polite as he could be, but he did not reply to their question.
"You are exceedingly ugly," said the wild ducks. "But that will not matter if you do not want to marry one of our family."
Poor thing! He had no thoughts of marriage. All he wanted was permission to lie among the rushes and drink some of the water on the moor. After he had been on the moor 2 days, there came 2 wild geese, or rather goslings, for they had not been out of the egg long, and were very saucy.
"Listen, friend," said one of them to the duckling, "you are so ugly that we like you very well. You will go with us and become a bird of passage. Not far from here is another moor, in which there are some pretty wild geese, all unmarried. It is a chance for you to get a wife. You may be lucky, ugly as you are."
Pop, pop, sounded in the air, and the 2 wild geese fell dead among the rushes, and the water was tinged with blood. Pop, pop, echoed far and wide in the distance, and the whole flock of wild geese rose up from the rushes. The sound continued from every direction, for the sportsmen surrounded the moor, and some were even seated on branches of trees overlooking the rushes. The blue smoke from the guns rose like clouds over the dark trees, and as it floated away across the water, a number of sporting dogs bounded in among the rushes, which bent beneath there wherever they went. How they terrified the poor duckling! He turned away his head to hide it under his wing, and at the same moment a large, terrible dog passed quite near him. His jaws were open, his tongue hung from his mouth, and his eyes glared fearfully. He thrust his nose close to the duckling, showing his sharp teeth, and then, splash, splash, he went into the water without touching him. "Ah," sighed the duckling, "how thankful I am for being so ugly. Even a dog will not bite me." And so he lay quite still, while the shot rattled through the rushes, and gun after gun was fired over him. It was late in the day before all became quiet, but even the poor young thing did not dare to move. He waited quietly for several hours, and then, after looking carefully round him, hastened away from the moor as fast as he could. He ran over field and meadow till a storm arose, and he could hardly struggle against it. Towards evening he reached a poor little cottage that seemed ready to fall, and only remained standing because it could not decide on which side to fall first. The storm continued so violent that the duckling could go on no further. He sat down by the cottage, and he noticed that the door was not quite closed in consequence of one of the hinges having given way. There was therefore a narrow opening near the bottom large enough for him to slip through, which he did very quietly, and got a shelter for the night. A woman, a tomcat, and a hen lived in this cottage. The tomcat, whom the mistress called my little son, was a great favorite. He could raise his back and purr, and could even throw out sparks from his fur if it were stroked the wrong way. The hen had very short legs, so she was called Chickie Shortlegs. She laid good eggs, and her mistress loved her as if she had been her own child. In the morning, the strange visitor was discovered, and the tomcat began to purr, and the hen to cluck.
"What is that noise about?"
said the old woman, looking around the room, but her sight was not very good, therefore. When she saw the duckling, she thought it must be a fat duck that had strayed from home.
"Oh, what a prize!" she exclaimed. "I hope it's not a drake, for then I shall have some duck's eggs. I must wait and see." So the duckling was allowed to remain on trial for 3 weeks, but there were no eggs. Now the tomcat was the master of the house, and the hen was mistress, and they always said, "We are the world," for they believed themselves to be half the world, and the better half, too. The duckling thought that others might hold a different opinion on the subject, but the hen would not listen to such doubts. "Can you lay eggs?" she asked. "No." "Then have the goodness to hold your tongue." "Can you raise your back or purr or throw out sparks?" said the tomcat. "No." "Then you have no right to express an opinion when sensible people are speaking." So the duckling sat in a corner, feeling very low-spirited, till the sunshine and the fresh air came into the room through the open door, and then he began to feel such a great longing for a swim on the water that he could not help telling the hen. "What an absurd idea," said the hen. "You have nothing else to do, therefore you have foolish fancies. You could purr or lay eggs. They would pass away." "But it is so delightful to swim about the water," said the duckling, "and so refreshing to feel it close over your head while you dive down to the bottom." "Delightful indeed," said the hen. "Why, you must be crazy. Ask the cat. He's the cleverest animal I know. Ask him how he would like to swim aboard the water, or to dive under it, for I will not speak of my own opinion. Ask our mistress, the old woman. There is no one in the world more clever than she is. Do you think she would like to swim, or let the water close over her head?" "You don't understand me," said the duckling. "We don't understand you. Who can understand you, I wonder? Do you consider yourself more clever than the cat, or the old woman? I will say nothing for myself. Don't imagine any such nonsense, child, and thank your good fortune that you have been received here. You are not in a warm room, and in society from which you may learn something. But you are a chatterer, and your company is not very agreeable. Believe me, I only speak for your own good. I may tell you unpleasant truths, but that is a proof of my friendship. I advise you, therefore, to lay eggs and learn to purr as quickly as possible." "I believe I must go out into the world again," said the duckling. "Yes, do," said the hen. So the duckling left the cottage, and soon found water on which he could swim and dive, but was avoided by all other animals because of its ugly appearance. Autumn came, and the leaves in the forest turned to orange and gold. Then, as winter approached, the wind caught them as they fell and whirled them in the cold air. The clouds, heavy with hail and snowflakes, hung low in the sky, and the raven stood on the ferns crying, "Quack, quack!" It made one shiver with cold to look at him. All this was very sad for the poor little duckling. One evening, just as the sun set amidst the radiant clouds, there came a large flock of beautiful birds out of the bushes. The duckling had never seen anything like them before. They were swans, and they curved their graceful necks, while their soft plumage shone with dazzling whiteness. They uttered a singular cry as they spread their glorious wings and flew away from those cold regions to warmer countries across the sea. As they mounted higher and higher in the air, the ugly duckling felt quite a strange sensation as he watched them. He whirled himself in the water like a wheel, stretched out his neck towards them, and uttered a cry so strange that it frightened himself. Could he ever forget those beautiful, happy birds? And when at last they were out of sight, he dived under the water, and rose again almost beside himself with excitement. He knew not the name of these birds, nor where they had flown, but he felt towards them as he had never felt for any other bird in the world. He was not envious of these beautiful creatures, but wished to be as lovely as they, Poor ugly creature! How gladly he would have lived even with the ducks, had they only given him encouragement. The winter grew colder and colder. He was obliged to swim about the water to keep it from freezing, but every night the space on which he swam became smaller and smaller. At length it froze so hard that the ice in the water crackled as he moved, and the duckling had to paddle with his legs as well as he could to keep the space from closing up. He became exhausted at last and lay still and helpless, frozen fast in the ice. Early in the morning, a peasant who was passing by saw what had happened. He broke the ice in places with his wooden shoe and carried the duckling home to his wife. The warmth revived the poor little creature. But when the children wanted to play with him, the duckling thought they would do him some harm. So he started up in terror, flooded into the milk pan, and splashed the milk about the room. Then the woman clapped her hands, which frightened him still more. He flew first into the butter cask, then into the meal tub, and out again. What a condition he was in! The woman screamed and struck at him with the tongs. The children laughed and screamed and tumbled all over each other in their efforts to catch him, but luckily he escaped. The door stood open. The poor creature could just manage to slip out among the bushes and lie down quite exhausted in the newly fallen snow. It would be very sad were I to relate all the misery and privations which the poor little duckling endured during the hard winter. But when it had passed, he found himself lying one morning in a moor, amongst the rushes. He felt the warm sun shining, and heard the larks singing, and saw that all around was beautiful spring. And the young bird felt that his wings were strong, as he flapped them against his sides and rose high into the air. They bore him onwards until he found himself in a large garden, before he well knew how it had happened. The apple trees were in full blossom, and the fragrant elders bent their long green branches down to the stream, which wound round a smooth lawn. Everything looked beautiful. It is the freshness of early spring. From a thicket close by came 3 beautiful white swans, rustling their feathers and swimming lightly over the smooth water. The duckling remembered the lovely birds and felt more strangely unhappy than ever. "I will fly to those royal birds," he exclaimed, "and they will kill me because I am so ugly and dare to approach them. But it does not matter. Better be killed by them than pecked by the ducks, beaten by the hens, pushed about by the maiden who feeds the poultry, or starved with hunger in the winter." Then he flew to the water and swam towards the beautiful swans. The moment they spied the stranger, they rushed to meet him with outstretched wings. "Kill me," said the poor bird, as he bent his head down to the surface of the water and awaited death. But what did he see in the clear stream below? His own image, no longer a dark gray bird, ugly and disagreeable to look at, but a graceful and beautiful swan. To be born in a duck's nest in a farmyard is of no consequence to a bird if it is hatched from a swan's egg. He now felt glad at having suffered sorrow and trouble, because it enabled him to enjoy so much better all the pleasures and happiness around him, for the great swans swam around the newcomer and stroked his neck with their beaks as a welcome. Into the garden presently came some little children, and threw bread and cake into the water. "See," cried the youngest, "there is a new one." And the rest were delighted and ran to their father and mother, dancing and clapping their hands and shouting joyously, "There is another swan come! A new one has arrived!" Then they threw more bread and cake into the water and said, "The new one is the most beautiful of all. He is so young and pretty." And the old swans bowed their heads before him.
Then he felt quite ashamed and hid his head under his wing, for he did not know what to do. He was so happy, and yet not at all proud. He had been persecuted and despised for his ugliness, and now he heard them say he was the most beautiful of all the birds. Even the elder tree bent down its bow into the water before him, and the sun shone warm and bright. Then he rustled his feathers, curved his slender neck, and cried joyfully from the depths of his heart, "I never dreamed of such happiness as this while I was an ugly duckling." The End. The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen. Read for you by Catherine Seeholster.